How you doing, Michael?
How's it going?
Good. How are you?
Pretty well, pretty well. Thank you for having me on again.
Sure thing. Michael, what did we talk about last time?
Uh, let's see if I can recall. It's been a minute. Um, Proof of Jesus. We talked about Isaiah, prophecies in the New Testament,
Mm-hmm.
um, moral subjectivity versus objectivity. Um, yeah, that's from what I can recall there. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, what's on your mind tonight?
Well, you did challenge me to read through some verses to look through the uh, the Old Testament prophecies, and one of the ones that I feel like a good argument that you really put on me that I was focused on. I didn't have time to look through everyone. Was Isaiah 53.
Sure.
You made a good counter argument saying that Isaiah, the servant that they're talking about, refers to the nation of Israel
Mm-hmm.
specifically, as you talked about earlier in Isaiah. And reading through it, I think I have sort of an answer to that. Reading through it, the servant in Isaiah talks about that their suffering will basically be the salvation of nations, if I'm looking at this right. But from the logical standpoint, I was thinking about that. That would mean that, in a way, the people that persecute, if Israel was the servant in this psalm in 53, then that would mean that the people by persecuting Israel would be justified, which doesn't seem very logical if that makes sense.
So there's
Uh,
some struggling there under what's happening with the suffering servant. So we have this situation happening where God says at the beginning of the section in chapter 40, He says it's time for Israel to leave their time in Babylon because their service has now been paid, right? Their sins have they've paid for their sins now. And it says they've actually received double for their sins, right? So they received the payment for their sins and then
mhm,
extra, right? And so the question
right.
we have to ask ourselves is why would that be the case? Why would God give them double for their sins? And he
Mhm,
explains between chapter 40 and chapter 59 on
right.
multiple occasions that he's doing it so that when the nations see the nation of Israel being vindicated, that they'll be so astonished that this is happening that they'll recognize that Yahweh is the one true God. In fact, Isaiah 62 says, "The nations will see your vindication and all the kings your glory. No more will you be termed forsaken." And then Micah 7:16 says something similar about roughly the same event. It says the nations will see and be ashamed of their might. They will lay their hands on their mouth and their ears will become deaf. So there's this idea carrying throughout not just Isaiah, but the other prophets that after the Babylonian exile, God's going to come in with a mighty and outstretched arm and demonstrate to everybody who's the real God, just like he did with the Exodus. Because with the Exodus, what did he do? He says, I'm going to send all these plagues. It's going to be a huge display. And then I'm going to, I'll be casting judgment on all the gods of Egypt, and everyone will know that I am the Lord. And so the exodus from Babylon is supposed to be similar to the exodus of Egypt.
Right, right.
Sorry, that was a long-winded answer.
No, no, that makes sense. That's an interesting counter. I'd give you that.
Let me suggest one thing though.
Mm,
So on the idea of like, shoot, is the servant the nation of Israel or is it an individual? Here's why I think here's the symmetry breaker. Okay, so if it's about an individual, then it just contradicts all the other prophecies about the Messiah. They just contradict. If it's about the nation of Israel, it actually matches all the other prophecies about the nation of Israel. We've got dozens of prophecies about Israel stating that God's going to completely restore them, and then all the nations are going to flock to Yahweh because they're so amazed. Like Zechariah chapter 8 says that 10 people from every nation and every tongue will grab hold of the sleeve of a Jew and ask to go with them because they have heard that God is with them. So this is kind of the idea is that God is doing something so amazing that all of the nations will just be like, holy shit, did you see what God did?
Fair enough.
But that's also why I can't be Jewish. That's one of the reasons, is because I don't think these prophecies came true.
Well, I mean, in a way, the nation of Israel did come back from our own doing. I guess you could argue if that's self-fulfillment or not. With our own will bringing that back into being over that divine providence with Israel coming back into existence.
Right. Look, I don't think we got around to some of the actual messianic prophecies when we chatted last time.
Mm.
We were I think we were talking about some of the ones that were listed in the New Testament, but there's a couple that might be really interesting for you. We can go, let's do Ezekiel 37.
Ezekiel.
So to me, when I'm looking, like the definition of a messianic prophecy is a little bit vague, but to me, I would say any prophecy that talks about the final Davidic king would be concerned. That'd be a messianic prophecy. Messiah just means anointed one, like a king.
Mm.
So if you go to Ezekiel 37, go to 24. Ezekiel refers to the Messiah in two different ways. He refers to him as David, and he also refers to him as a prince and also a king. So in 24, it says, my servant David will be king over them. They will have one shepherd. They shall follow my ordinances and be careful to observe my statutes. They shall live in the land that I gave to my servant Jacob, in which your ancestors lived. They and their children and their children's children shall live there forever, and my servant David will be their prince forever. Now, one of the big issues that we have in Ezekiel 37 is this seems to be a prediction for what's going to happen after the Babylonian exile. Because if you go to the beginning of the chapter, Ezekiel is prophesying about post-Babylon, right? So he gives the vision of the dry bones, the valley of the dry bones, right? And then in verse 11, he says, mortal, these bones are the whole house of Israel. They say, our bones are dried up and our hope is lost. We are cut off completely because they've been cut off from their land. Therefore, prophesy and say to them, so on and so forth, right? So it seems to me that Ezekiel was under the understanding that after the Babylonian exile, we would have this Davidic kingdom again, and it would never end. And then it just didn't happen.
Yeah, and I think that's also one of the main reasons as well in the New Testament. The Pharisees were also against Jesus, is because they were expecting a military kingdom like it was described in Ezekiel, but I believe the perspective is it brought about a different type of kingdom, and that's a lot of the conflict they had with Jesus actually in the New Testament as well.
Yeah,
if I'm not mistaken.
I don't think you're wrong. I think there's kind of two different voices in the Gospels in terms of what they thought Jesus was supposed to do. And I think one of the chapters that is helpful for kind of elucidating this is Luke chapter 1. So go to Luke chapter 1 and go to 33. There's a prophecy about Jesus. So we're in the infancy territory, right? And he says, he will be great, in 32, he will be great and he will be called the Son of the Most High, and the Lord God will give to him the throne of his ancestor David, and he will reign over the house of Jacob forever, and of his kingdom there will be no end. So this sounds like a physical kingdom. He's going to get the throne of King David, and if you had any question about whether this was a spiritual or a physical throne, he kind of clears it up in like 72. So later down in verse 60 or 70, if we start in 68, blessed be the Lord God of Israel, for he has looked favorably upon his people and has redeemed them. He has raised up a mighty Savior for us in the house of his child David, as he spoke through the mouth of his holy prophets of old. So the question is, what did they say, right? Well, it says that we would be saved from our enemies and the hand of all who hate us. So even like in Luke is kind of paraphrasing Jeremiah 23 and Jeremiah 33. And Luke is saying, listen, the prophecy said that we would be saved from the hands of our enemies. And so my interpretation is that Luke, or whoever wrote Luke, understood the prophecies the same way that the Jews did, and they end the same way I do. It's just that he was assuming Jesus would come back and do it like soon.
Right. Right. That makes sense. And I believe that actually plays into it that the current theological consensus is that Jesus will come back, but this time with a sword.
Right.
Described in that vision, yeah.
100%. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. So, and the question I would have is, it seems to be that what's happening is like all of the actual messianic parts of the prophecies, like the stuff that makes you the real Messiah, all of those things get pushed to the second coming. The stuff that he did when he was here is like really generic stuff that anybody could have done, like dying. I mean, I don't believe there's a messianic prophecy about dying, but theoretically that's the main thing he did when he was here. But like anyone could do that, really. That's not really all that special, right? So like
well, I guess it would be the special thing was that he came back, apparently.
Right, but
yeah,
and this is where it gets sticky, right? Is because theoretically, we would expect to see a prophecy about the Messiah dying, rising, and then coming back thousands of years later. But none of the prophecies really read like that. It doesn't read that the Messiah is going to die and then come back many years later. It just reads that the Messiah is going to come. So you have to kind of invent two different comings when there's not really two different comings in the text.
Right. Okay.
And it seems like the reason why you need two comings is because like the legitimate stuff just didn't happen.
What do you mean the legitimate stuff didn't happen? You mean like in terms of the prophecies or what Jesus did? I suppose.
Right. Yeah. The stuff that you could test that would make you a bona fide Messiah doesn't seem to happen. Like, I think we can boil down, there needs to be two criteria. One, need to be an actual king. I think that's explicit in the text. Number two is, I think you actually need to enact world peace. Like everybody has to be at peace. These two are so firmly rooted in the Old Testament prophecies that the Jews, even today, have a slogan. It's a two-part slogan. Sometimes they say one part, sometimes they say both. But they'll say, no peace, no Messiah. Or they'll say, no king, no Messiah. It's this general idea that like anyone who's really familiar with the Hebrew Bible knows that the two main things the Messiah is supposed to do is bring peace and to be a king.
Well, I guess you could say he did become king of the spiritual world, in a way. Christ's kingdom, God's kingdom.
Right. Yes. That's what the New Testament is trying to say, right? So Luke says,
yeah, that's the lens it takes it for is the kingdom of God, essentially. He's now the king of this new kingdom, which in a way is the church, and that's its kingdom on earth. And of course, to enact a new kingdom when he comes back. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's basically it, right? The general idea is that it's not a literal kingdom; it's a spiritual kingdom.
Right.
But that gets really muddy to me because it seems to me from the Hebrew Bible that when it talks about like spiritual matters, it's not referring to like the immaterial world. Like spirits actually existed in the real world. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Sometimes you'll find them in the Bible listed as shades instead of spirits.
Shades, like a shade of a soul, perhaps, or
yes.
Yeah.
Yep. Or you'll find that they're visible too. Like so, when Solomon is raised from the dead by Saul in the Witch of Endor, like he's visible. Like as they're witnessing him come up, they describe what they witnessed. He says he looks like, the son of a god. So like these spirits have like a physical, manifestation in the physical world. They don't seem to be immaterial.
Yeah. Probably into the metaphysics. I think I don't really comprehend the whole aspects of of multiple planes or anything. I've heard the arguments before that the spiritual realm is a different plane of existence entirely, and I'm nowhere at that level of intellect to break down the science or the logic behind that sort of argument of something immaterial manifesting materially. Um, it's an interesting thought, I think, but yeah.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I don't really know where I'm going with this line of this logic here.
That's okay. I think part of the problem with the afterlife is like the book of Revelation and elsewhere talks about how it's going to be a renewed heaven and renewed earth, like Revelation 21. And like all the stuff that was wrong is going to be made right in the renewed heaven and renewed earth, but it's going to be here on the actual earth, where the wolf lies down with the lamb and the kid lies down with the snake, and so on and so forth. It seems to me that from most of the Bible, the renewed heaven and the renewed earth is the afterlife. It's not like a spiritual, otherworldly plane. It's here on the earth. They're just going to fix all the stuff.
Right, and I think that was actually brought up to me at one point. Is that someone brought up that it's a theological misconception that the Bible says that people are in heaven right now, but based on the Book of Revelation, people aren't in heaven yet, because the heaven will be because there will be a new heaven and new earth as described in Revelation, and that will be basically after the earth is destroyed and made anew. That will be God's kingdom, essentially.
Right.
The afterlife, yeah.
Let me.
And I thought that's also something interesting that a lot of Christians kind of perceive, like, oh, once you die, you go to heaven. But the Bible more describes it as, from what I understand, a period of rest. I'm not sure if that's entirely theologically sound.
It is
before the time of judgment comes about. So I don't know, just poor literacy, or maybe we don't read our Bibles enough. Maybe.
Trust me, like you're reading it more than most Christians. Let me tap into 21 real quick with the new heaven and new earth. So that I saw a new heaven and a new earth, and the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "See, the home of God is among mortals." So it seems to be this idea that when this heavenly period happens, it's going to be here on the actual earth where we're at. Like God's dwelling in the heavens is going to come down to earth. Kind of the problem we have with this is everybody in the ancient world, including the biblical authors, kind of assumed that God's home is just up in the skies. So when we say the word heaven, like both in Greek and in Hebrew, it refers to just the skies above our heads. It wasn't until later time periods when we were able to explore the heavens that we were like, oh, it can't be the heavens above our head because there's no gods up there, right? And so we had to recreate this idea of what heaven meant to be. But in the biblical text, the afterlife, the heaven is always going to be the renewed earth, and the heavens just the clouds and whatnot above our heads.
Yeah. Well, maybe that is describing actually like what John is seeing in the process. Is like he's actually seeing something come down from space, from the sky, perhaps. But I mean, I'm not sure where else heaven would be mentioned like that. Again, I'm not too familiar with the Greek or the Hebrew where it would be described in other parts. I wonder if it's described that in other places where it describes the afterlife other than Revelation in this instance.
So I think the problem I have with this New Testament idea of the afterlife and heaven and whatnot is it seems to be that everybody assumed it was happening imminently. So like in 1 Corinthians 7, Paul is instructing people, like, if you're not married, don't get married. If you are married, live as though you're not married. Like, don't even have kids. Because he says, the present form of this world is passing away. Like his understanding, he says something similar in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. His understanding was that the world is passing away imminently. And Jesus says the same thing in Revelation. He says, these are the things that are soon to take place. So like my reading of the New Testament is that it's like a failed, end times apocalyptic cult.
I mean, That's a good point, and I've heard the argument put forward that in terms of what is soon, I believe it's ascribed. I think it's in the Old Testament. I forget in which verse exactly that. Uh, uh, 1,000 years to God is like a day. I'm not sure if I'm quoting that exactly right. Um,
Close enough.
yeah, uh, and I know this is a sidetrack point, but someone has brought up the fact, well, actually, maybe it's going to be like it is in 3 days, where it's essentially close to maybe 3,000 years or 2,000 and some change. Exactly. But that's reading into like when people think the end would actually come. But that's a sidetrack, I guess, in that point. And I believe also in the Bible, it mentions that no man will know the day or the hour.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus did mention that at some point in one of the synoptics, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he did.
Yeah. Again, I'm sorry. I'm not if I misquote anything in particular.
No, you're doing great.
Yeah. But yeah, I guess the only argument is that Paul really wouldn't know when it was. So I guess he was just writing to the churches at the time to act like the time could be at any point, because it really could have been.
Right.
So.
And I think the reason why Paul was under the impression was because Jesus, I think, taught that he was. I think Jesus taught his disciples he was coming back imminently. Because in Matthew 16, 27 through 28, he says that he's coming back. It says, some of you standing here will not pass away until he comes riding on the clouds. Let me grab that passage real quick.
Yeah. That's I've actually read over that one before, and I have struggled with that passage specifically. I know that I think the Mormon tradition is that they believe that John is still alive, but from what we understand from historical accounts, I think that John actually is dead.
Yeah, he's gone. It's also true that it says some, and some is always more than one and less than all. And this is a tough one. This is actually the very first Bible passage that I heard that was problematic for me. I was probably 16 or 17. I was in Catholic school, and it came up during one of our religion courses, and we had a pretty lengthy discussion on it. At the time, I was willing to accept the apologetic for it, but over the course of years, I found the apologetic to not be as palatable. But it's a tough one.
Yeah. Right.
Michael, how long have you been a Christian?
I was baptized when I was 8 years old, but I actually came to the faith of my own reasoning when I was 16.
Okay.
I didn't exactly grow up in a Christian home. My grandfather was a pastor, but my dad and mom were not religious by any sense of mean. There's still some moral disagreements. I love my parents, but there's things we disagree on. Morally, I've had arguments specifically about objective morality. If there is true right or wrong, or if things are subjective, I've had this argument with my stepmom plenty of times. But yeah, it was a moment where I kind of came to a realization that my life, essentially, I was living a life essentially where I was very prideful. I was living by my own means, and I kind of came to a moment where I had to see that I was blaming the world for the problems in my life. Like I was saying, but that moment I kind of realized, like, yeah, that's what the problems that are in my life are on my own doing, my own sinful nature, I guess. And I gave it to Jesus at that moment. And over the years, I've kind of been reading more into it, trying to understand the faith as much as I can. And I'm sorry if I'm rambling too much, or I'm being
no, you're doing great.
Incoherent here. It is a little late for me, but
yeah, me too. I got to get to bed soon. But it sounds to me like you're just kind of wrestling with reality, and I think that's what we're all doing. Like we're all just wrestling with reality, trying to figure out what's real and what's not. And so I can definitely sympathize with where you're at. I was a young Christian myself when I was your age, that, was really born again in my teenage years. And then as I got into my younger 20s, started to really study the Bible and ask difficult questions, because I did not want to believe on blind faith. And then I went to Bible college and seminary, and it was, for me, it was really studying the Bible that proved to me that it is not true. Now, that doesn't mean there's no God. Like, it's possible that there's still a God, just not this God. I came to the conclusion that there's no God, but it certainly is possible that there is a God, and it's just not like anything we can describe. That being said, I'm 100% convinced that the God of the Bible can't exist. Not the way the Bible describes it.
Right.
Right.
I mean,
Mhm.
I guess my main point, I guess I argued this before, would be the historical, what we know for sure about Jesus, him existing. He was crucified under Pontius Pilate, and then but people claim that he came back, and I think that's what really is like sold. Is like, okay, so a lot of people claim to the point of death that they saw this man come back from the dead. And, you know, I've heard the argument before, like, oh yeah, people can die for a lie, but you wouldn't die for something you know to be a lie and still proclaim it. And that's something I really struggle with, to think about. Like, it's something very crazy to think about. It's ridiculous to think like, oh, this man died and he came back from the dead and he claims to be God. So it's a really weird thing, and it's hard to struggle with. But I that's one thing that I still can't wrap my head around, how else that would be. I guess that so many people would proclaim that they saw someone come back and then die after being basically tortured, saying like, hey, stop saying this, and they wouldn't. So
Right. And so I can understand why that's a powerful argument for you. On my side, I would ask, how do we know that that is actually the case? Because the stories we have of the martyrdom of the disciples are many hundreds of years after the fact, and they include all kinds of really crazy details. Like if you read the apocryphal Acts of Peter, like Simon Magus and Peter get into a wizard's duel, and a dog gives a speech. And there's a suckling baby at his mother's teat that ends up giving a speech. So like the idea that the disciples were like, they were steadfastly convinced unto death of what they witnessed, to me, I don't think seems all that true. Because if I like, there are other accounts of what happened to some of his disciples, like in Sanhedrin 43a in the Talmud, where it seems like they didn't really have a choice. Like when they rounded up Jesus to kill him, they grabbed his disciples and killed them too. It wasn't that they gave them the option to renounce their faith and save themselves. It seems like they're like, hey, here's some troublemakers. Let's take care of it.
But I mean, from this, we know that at least that some of the disciples were around, at least, because to start the early church, you had Peter and John as well that were that wrote the book of Revelation later on. At least it was attributed to them. So I don't know how accurate that account would be, that they killed all the disciples immediately. I mean, they definitely survived after the fact.
There are,
we understand, unless I'm mistaken.
You're not mistaken. There are 5 of them that were murdered alongside of Jesus, or shortly after Jesus, according to the writings of the Sanhedrin. According to the Bible, we only have James, not James the brother, James the son of Alphaeus, I believe. So we, or was it Zebedee? I forget.
I don't know how to correct you.
It's okay. But so James died in the Bible. It seems pretty likely that Paul was died in prison, or I think that's what happened. But we're not really told.
I do believe that is what happened. He died in prison.
Yeah. So like, we don't really know how these people died. It's possible that they caused enough trouble that the Romans were just like, okay, time to get rid of them. And like, they didn't give them the option to recant their faith. It's also possible that they weren't executed at all, and these are just mythologies. But that being said, I think people are willing to... Let me tell you what I think happened, okay? In the first century, there were a lot of resurrection accounts. There was a big fervor over people who theoretically resurrected. I can think of like a dozen people that claim to have resurrected around the time of Jesus. The most famous is probably Nero, right? Some of them were so believable because there were imposters coming through later claiming to be that resurrected person. And so they were convincing many people. So, for example, the Parthian army went to war with the Romans, believing that the resurrected Nero was leading them into war. and he had been deified. He had resurrected and was deified and was going to lead them in the war, and they would put him on his rightful place on the throne. And then they got devastated, right? So I think probably an imposter came along just like Nero and claimed, I'm the resurrected Jesus, to one or two people. That was enough to get the ball rolling. They were completely convinced. And then the disciples that were so grief-stricken were like, oh my God, he came back from the dead. Because we have similar accounts in history from this time period of many people believing that an individual raised from the dead just based on the witness of one or two people. Right.
Well, from the gospel accounts, you've had these people like the disciples that have lived, dined, and followed Jesus around. I don't know if they would be so easily convinced that it was an imposter that they saw. If the accounts are to be believed, that they saw him in person and actually had ate and touched him physically.
Right. Well, I think that the fact that it was an imposter explains why on the road to Emmaus, they didn't recognize him. Mary Magdalene didn't recognize him. Oh, I would also say too that I don't believe the Gospels are true, right? I think they're mythologies. For example, there was a narrative that was written about of a Greek man who resurrected, where in the original earliest story of the Greek man, the body just went missing. That was it. No one knew what happened to it. Subsequent stories were built, and it eventually ended with, 300 years later, people claiming he wasn't just dead and the body missing. He actually resurrected, and there were witnesses, and it started a cult following, right? So for me, it's hard. Like when I'm reading the other texts from the time period, it's hard for me to believe that what we hear about, like what we read in the Gospels, is like a legitimate historical account, because I see other accounts just like them purporting the same claims.
I mean, it's definitely an interesting it's an interesting thing to think about, because that would be like legit the crux of the argument.
Right.
Is, did Jesus come back from the dead? And if so, what do you believe about that? That would be like really the core foundation for this argument. And it's an interesting thing to grapple with.
There's a book I want to send to you. It's a very academic work. It's expensive. I'll send it to you. You don't have to pay for it, okay? I'll pay for it. It's called.
You don't have to. That's a little. That's I don't want to cause a financial burden on you.
No. It's really, trust me, it's not a burden for me. Also, it's a really good book, and I think it'll put some context to what's happening with this whole empty tomb situation. There's a scholar named John Cook who wrote a book called Empty Tomb, Resurrection, Apotheosis, where he documents how empty tombs, resurrections, and apotheosis was very common at the time of Jesus, and demonstrates how Jesus's narrative is very similar to other narratives from the time period. I think it'd be worthwhile to skim through it, even if you don't read the whole thing. It is like 700 pages, so
Wow.
You're probably not going to read the whole thing overnight, but it's definitely worth skimming through and seeing, oh, here's other stories of people sound very familiar with Jesus' story.
Well, at the very least, I think it would be good for argument's sake to, at least from either way, exploring and finding truth. I think that's very important, is knowing what's true. And from what I understand, I believe that currently that Jesus did rise from the dead, and I do believe that to be objectively true. But I'm willing to at least look over arguments and dissect them and try and get things right and see what's what. I suppose.
Well, let's do this. It's almost my bedtime.
It is almost mine as well.
I know. I think we're in the same time zone. You're delightful to talk to. Come back soon. When you come back, let's talk resurrection. And we'll kind of cover some of the basis points of the resurrection, because I think it's a good topic.
Right. It's the juxtaposition. I think Paul actually writes that if Christ has not come back from the dead, then you are still dead in your sins, essentially. So that is essentially the core aspect of Christianity right there.
1 Corinthians. Nailed it. Yep. 100%. All right, Michael, listen, these are difficult conversations and you're handling them very well. So kudos to you.
Well, thank you. I try to be patient and graceful, attempt to, God willing, or whatever you believe, I suppose.
Well, thanks for coming and chat with us, and come back soon, okay?
Thank you. You have a
Cheers,
nice
friend.
night.